I saw 4 questions. We'll start there with Sara.
Thank you very much for an inspiring and interesting presentation. My name is Sarah Modig, working as an independent now, but with a background in innovation policy in Sweden for many years. A question that I lack in your presentation is that I do agree on your argument that there is an active role for the state to play in market making. But what markets should the state then choose? That becomes a highly crucial issue. And then I think it's important to keep in mind 2 different points of departures. Should we choose interventions where we think that the Swedish private sector might have an international comparative advantage? Or should we try to prioritize markets where sort of the state has a mission of its own? The examples I see in your presentations are from the latter. It's from the energy sector, it's from the defense sector, it's from the medical, the healthcare sector, where the state does provide, it has a mission from the citizens to supply services. That's for me 2 different kinds of prioritizations. And for me, the argument is valid when it comes from this other type, the state as a supplier of services that then needs new innovative solutions in order to supply those services that it's convened to supply by its citizens. But then again, as an actor from more, let's say, a competition policy, interventionist kind, I'm more reluctant on the argument. Thank you.
I think we can pass it straight on to right here, please. Oh, right there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Paris Saxon work for a rail equipment company called Bombardier. Question on procurement, which is also a very important role for the state to play. There are plans to or schemes to promote innovation procurement. It's very hard to implement, and I would like to hear your take on that, because the experience is that all the time life cycle costs and the innovation aspect are ignored in this country and other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then we'll take Pontus, and then we'll finish off in the thing.
You're relying on my...
Okay, thank you very much for a nice presentation. Question. I mean, all these issues that we are discussing has to do with how do we draw the borderline between the governmental actions and the private sector actions. Now, the examples you bring about here, are they necessarily hinting at the failure from the government? Because you started with a symbiotic relationship between the government and the private actors. And you show how the iPhone actually is a very successful example. And obviously the different sectors here seems to have played a constructive role. Does it necessarily mean that we need more of government action, or can't we read your book at it has actually worked pretty well? So that is the first question. The other is policy failures, and you addressed that. How do we correct them? What is the corrective mechanism here? How do we do our balances and checks, so to speak? And third, isn't it sort of intuitively logic to think that the role of the government is dynamic depending on the problem that we face? You refer a lot to the energy situation, a lot of uncertainty, probably a bigger role for the government to play there. So it changes over time, I would say.
Okay.
Those are my 3 comments.
Sorry, Mariana. Last question, and then we'll give you. I'll help you. I'll remind you with.
Thank you. Niels Carlson at the Roths Institute. I have a question concerning innovation systems and the examples you mentioned. You mentioned Finland, you mentioned Japan, and then you mentioned a lot of examples from the US. And these systems are extremely different, I think. And it turns out that the 2 first systems, the Finnish system, coordinated system, quite centralized, innovation board and so on, and the Japanese system, I would argue, are failures. They have not worked really well in the last years. Finland, the last 5 years, Japan, the last 20 years, I would say. Productivity growth has been extremely low. They have been stagnating countries, actually. While the US, which is a lot more pluralistic, it's not coordinated in that sense. You have various sources of finance for innovations and so on. Well, seems to be more innovative. And one of the questions I think is important here, is which is very important, I think, for the Swedish discussion, is the relationship to established industries, established companies, and so on. Both Japan, Finland, and Sweden relies on a number of 10, 15, I would say, major companies that are very important in our innovation systems. The big risk is that you, in fact, crowd out the unborn, the new companies, the new sectors, which in the end are extremely important for innovation. The existing companies are important as well. How do you see this balance, and how do you look on this innovation system? And why do you make such a big deal of the US?
So thank you very much. So I think the last question ties a lot in with what Sara is saying. Which markets, or should you focus on competitive advantage or create new markets according to social challenges? Then we had the question about procurement.
Sorry, start reminding me halfway through.
Okay,
Not
go
now.
ahead.
And okay, so because I have a little order, but I'm gonna. So, in fact, let me just actually start with one part of the last question. I thought I made it clear, but perhaps I didn't. The reason I focus on the U.S. is not that the U.S. is necessarily much better than some other examples. Also, because Silicon Valley is not the U.S. You can go to many parts of the U.S. and it feels more third world than some third world countries. I know that's no longer a politically correct term, but I'm sorry. There is a third world where people are still suffering hugely, and the U.S. has lots of that kind of thing. So Silicon Valley happens to be a little region that unfortunately or fortunately is a model for so many places. So the reason I focus on it is, well, let's actually look at what happened in that damn place instead of just talking about it. And I sort of try to describe the narrative of what happened there in a very different way. Okay, so let me just start off with that. There's so many points. So the first one, in terms of what kind of missions, or how prescriptive, how does one choose? That's a really, really important point, because when I probably didn't make enough of it, but when I talk about kind of mission-oriented investments versus market failure investments, I'm talking about something specific, which is looking around, and again, including Silicon Valley, but I'm going to stop talking about Silicon Valley, places where there was kind of a mission by government to do something big, not big state, big thinking. And when I talk about big thinking, I use this word kind of mission-oriented. And it's not just things like the mass production revolution and looking at what happened behind it, but actually understanding what allowed it to get fully deployed. Because any of these revolutions, whether it's IT, biotech, nanotech, lots of this brain stuff, again, that's happening today, is not enough. It actually then has to have an effect on the economy. And even there, we see that big thinking mattered, which doesn't mean correct thinking, it just means big thinking, and then we can evaluate whether good things happen or bad. But suburbanization was a policy. People didn't just wake up one morning and want to go live in New Jersey or whatever, in the suburbs. It was actually an outcome of policy, which allowed the mass production revolution, which also had, then one could look at the technological stuff, lots of state funding, but let's forget that for now. It allowed that revolution to get fully deployed. Okay, without suburbanization, it would have just kind of been stuck in one part of the economy. So that's what I mean today when I say big thinking, what we actually need, and I'm quite inspired by the work of someone called Carlota Perez, and we've recently written together a paper, which if you're interested, I can send you on this issue, which is, what she says is something really interesting about green. She says green is not a revolution. You look at all these technologies, and green, they've been around for a long time. What green could become, and if you look at what's happening in China, this is kind of how they're thinking, is a direction through which the IT revolution, which has not been fully deployed, and lots of people are writing about that. Robert Gordon, who says that the indoor toilet had more of an effect than the internet. Anyway, that's a whole other debate. Through which the IT revolution, which has not been fully deployed in many countries throughout the entire economy, can be. So green as a direction it has to be, though, an outcome of policy choice. It's not just going to happen, just like suburbanization didn't happen. So that's a really important point to make, because otherwise we just get too involved in, that technology or that. So it's not about solar versus offshore wind. that when we start talking about specific technologies, that is important in terms of the portfolio approach, which is there's going to be a shitload of failures with wind and solar. Again, Solyndra, massive failure. And so if you have a portfolio within some of these areas, then and an ability to reap some of the return through equity stakes, why not? Especially if you're not willing to move the tax system, which, to be honest, I'm happy in Sweden, keep your tax system. You don't have to, increase taxes necessarily. But you do have to be realistic that you're going to have huge failures. It's inevitable. And your population is going to say, but you failed. So unless you can also say, yeah, but we also won. And when we won, something came back, not into the pockets of corrupt ministers. We like to use that corrupt minister mythology, but into the fund that was responsible, right? So Google's algorithm was funded by the National Science Foundation. Google does not pay much tax. We know that. This is not me telling you. Google does not pay much tax. It's in all the newspapers. So what's going to happen to the future of the US system? And this is, I'll jump to the last question. This is not about any of these countries being static. It's not the US, Japan, Brazil, Sweden. These countries are changing. So the US system is really problematic precisely because it hasn't thought these things through. They got some of the story right. They got the whole innovation system funded by government and in the past a committed private sector. So this is a financialization point, which is quite recent. It's kind of since 2000 that these companies have gone crazy in terms of focusing really just on shareholder value. Shareholder value, began in the 80s, but since the end of the 90s, in terms of how much corporate profits are actually coming back into production and investment is problematic. And so what the US system is under risk today, my work was actually, and again, I don't want to sound arrogant, but just to say, even in the US, they're using it to defend the system. It was brought up in a recent Senate Appropriations Committee, where there was a head of DARPA, head of NSF, head of NIH, and the Department of Energy. And they actually put up the slides of my book and said, and the financial markets like this stuff, because then they put up the FT review, because they're under threat, they're being cut. Right, so this wrong narrative, which is saying, oh, it's just the entrepreneurs, is putting in threat, and sorry, who's saying that narrative? It is some of the enterprises, not the big thinking companies. Again, Bill Gates does not talk like this, right? Some mediocre, very influential lobbyists are constantly trying to, if you want, get the state out of the way in the short term, but it's putting the US long-run competitiveness in huge risk. So the US system, by not admitting that you need this functional ecosystem, might not continue to sort of do what it was doing. I think I'm spending too much time on some of these. I don't know, what can I say? So Bombardier, procurement, right? It was you. Well, they recently lost a procurement contract in the in the UK to Siemens, right?
You win, you lose.
Well, no, but this was very interesting in the UK. I'll just give the story in the UK just as an example. Then immediately people were like, "This is screwed up. That's wrong. We should have protected sort of UK business." And Bombardier is actually Canadian, but they treated it as if it was UK business because it was hiring UK workers, without realizing that what is Siemens a product of, right? So what should people in the UK be raising a storm over? Is it the wrong procurement policies and conditions? Is it European competition laws? Or is it the complete lack of any innovation policy, coherent and industrial policy in the UK, which hasn't produced the Siemenses? And this is why the whole Eurozone debate is so screwed up. We're pretending that the German companies and Germany has become this export-led nation because of these Schroeder reforms, keeping down wages while productivity was increasing, not admitting that actually that was just to retain employment, right? When East and West joined, unless they did that, they would have had mass unemployment, which they didn't do. So that was to retain employment. For competitiveness, they have patient, long-term committed finance, they have the Fraunhofer Institutes, they have higher R&D to GDP, and they direct it towards this new massive green vision. So Siemens won the contract because they produced the green, fast, modern trains, So it's just to say that there surely are some bureaucratic issues around procurement policy. But if you have sort of a solidarity across Europe and that we actually admit what it takes to become competitive, so we don't make Spain cut its publicly funded research by 40%, which is what it's had to do to fit to this new 3% stuff, right? Then you could actually really be competing on the same sort of level. And then as long as you get the procurement policies in place, it's about which company really will in the UK produce the best trains. And come on, Siemens, come and produce them. But it's so interesting how that whole issue in the UK became really divided about procurement laws and policies as opposed to the lack of industrial policy in the UK that produced a real competitor to Siemens. Anyway, startups, the new versus the old. The problem is startups in and of themselves, who the hell cares, right? Teachers are important. Do we have all this great teacher policy? No. Startups are, okay, first of all, there's huge failures, we know that. But if you actually look at most SMEs, right, very little job creation, net job creation, very little innovation, very little productivity. So what you actually want are these kind of high growth, innovative firms, these gazelles, which make up about 4% of the whole SME, small, medium enterprise population. And if you actually look at the ones that have been really successful, not only have they been a result of lots of state funding, which I go through my book, but also a really important relationship with the large companies. So this is one of the issues that, again, in the US, this is not happening very well today. We don't have, or take Italy, Fiat used to be, when it was innovating a lot and also investing a lot of its profits back into production, its relationship with small companies around Turin was very different from Fiat today in Turin, which is not making those investments, which has also, in a different way, it's not the share buybacks, but in a different way, become increasingly financialized. So this is the ecosystem approach, but not the usual way we talk about it, which is you don't mythologize startups. You have to admit that the successful ones have to be part of a system with strategic, mission-oriented public financing across the whole chain, so the SBIR kind of financing which VC will not give them, and relationships with large companies which they're feeding products to, which is functional. So Pfizer has a really dysfunctional relationship with lots of the companies it's buying up in biotech, and the biotech sector is really suffering from that. But this is not about small, cute little biotech firms, aren't you cute, and oh, terrible Pfizer financialized. This is about saying the system is not working and why. It's not about big versus large, state versus private. It's about identifying the kind of conditions you need in place, and surely this increasing financialized pharmaceutical sector and increasingly IT sector, and unfortunately emerging financialized green sector, is not good for startups.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's clear that I think we would have needed a little bit more time because I think everything you said has provided a lot of food for thought. I want to thank you a lot for coming. I want to thank the panelists. There will be some refreshments. If you got out of the door to your right, Mariana will also be interviewed by some journalists, so I would kindly ask you to sort of move your conversation outside. And I just want to finish with, I think, perhaps the elephant in the room. In Sweden, we pride ourselves on the fact that we are top in all the innovation rankings, yet we do not figure in your book. And so the question is why, and I think we'll take that to the cocktail. Thank you.